Hello again. I am sure many viewers must have noticed that I am a little fussy and pedantic at times about my use of language. The reason for this is simple enough. Sloppy and imprecise use of language tend to lead inexorably to sloppy and imprecise thinking. If you're discussing something trivial like a football match or a new series on the television, this doesn't really matter. We speak vaguely and don't bother to define our terms. That's fine. When you're talking of something like racial prejudice or the possible existence of institutional racism, it really does matter because the consequences of one side or the other being right in such a discussion can be momentous. One only need remember the Macpherson report, which branded the Metropolitan Police institutionally racist, to see what the long-term effect such a conclusion can have. So it's worth, under those circumstances, being very sure what we all mean by certain words and to be clear about what we are or are not saying. One of the things which I've long noticed about those with racial prejudice is that they seldom use words like some or all, nor do they apparently think in such terms. If somebody says that black men are aggressive, it would help if we knew whether the assertion meant that all black men are aggressive or whether the speaker is just saying that some black men are aggressive. The one statement is undeniably true and the other demonstrably false. What I find intriguing and amusing in a rather grim and ironic way is the tendency now of some anti-racists to have latched onto this vague way of speaking, and to the extent that they now use it all the time. It makes any conversation about racism and anti-racism very heavy going, because both sides are using weird, vague language, and you can never quite understand what a racist is asserting any more than you can what an anti-racist is trying to say. For example, if somebody claims that white people are racist, and I've seen this claim repeated all over the place, I'm often itching to ask if they're saying that all white people are racist or some white people are racist. There's a great deal of difference between those two ideas. Take a recent television programme from the BBC called Is Uni Racist. I give a link to this in the description to this video. Immediately we see the problem that we've just been talking about. Are we asking if some people at universities are racists? I can well believe that that's true. If that's the question, well then there's hardly any point asking it. Or are we asking if everybody at all universities are racist? And that universities themselves are somehow institutionally racist? That sounds a lot less likely. What do the BBC mean when they ask, is uni racist? We have no idea at all. Precisely because nobody's bothering to speak clearly anymore. I looked at the programme and I found it pretty rotten. It was claimed that 1 in 4 of black or other ethnic minority students who took part in some survey had experienced racial harassment since their course started. 1 in 20 students said they had left their course because of it. This sounds very scary until we look at where the information comes from. It's from an online survey conducted by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission between 2018 and 2019. The first thing to bear in mind is that hardly anybody takes part in those online surveys, and those that do are often weird, they're cranks. You see this whether the subject of the online survey is racism in universities or home education or vaccines or anything else. Usually those that respond or take part in those consultations are a bit strange anyway. However, I took the trouble to track down the original survey, as I so often do, and have a look at what the information actually was. Okay, we're talking about 585 students. By the way, I'll give a link to the survey. 585 students made allegations relating to racism. 2 points spring to mind at once. 585 out of how many? In other words, how many students in Britain are at institutions of higher education? Anybody want to guess? Well, the answer is that there's almost 2.5 million, which I must admit surprised me. So this makes the fewer than 600 people unearthed by the survey, to which I provide a link, as I say, seem a little less startling. Talking about 1 in 4 would suggest that those 600 people, it might be only a few thousand students in total. It's not. 2.38 million students in higher education, and 585 made allegations of racism. The second question is, what processes were in place to ensure that all these students, these 585 complaints, were different people? Was each person assigned a unique reference number? Was it possible to submit multiple responses to the survey? That's something that's often done to skew results in those online surveys, by the way. People create new accounts, Hotmail accounts, and then they'll send in half a dozen or even 10 or 12 responses. Again, this isn't just to do with racism. You see this in all sorts of different topics. Well, we don't know. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission don't give details on that. The programme itself made it clear that the problem lay less in actual racism, which is certainly what the title suggested. Is Uni Racist? The suggestion is that there's a lot of racism, or that students experience a lot of racial prejudice at university. It made it clear that the problem was less that, which appeared to be pretty rare anyway, and more in the supposed failures of staff to investigate complaints effectively. Now, that's a completely different thing from racial prejudice. That's another matter entirely. It would be interesting to compare the speed and efficiency of complaints investigated by universities in general. Are they slower at investigating racism than they are with dealing with complaints about the heating breaking down, or about food or poor quality teaching? Might the problem, in fact, be that universities tend to fob off students with vague promises about doing things and then not even bothering, rather than this being a specific lack of action on allegations of supposed racism? My suspicion is that it's a general thing, that universities don't have the time or energy, or they can't be bothered to investigate complaints by students, and that they adopt a general policy of stonewalling and hoping that students will give up on what they're saying. That's not at all what the title of this BBC programme suggested, which is another reason for trying to avoid vagueness in such matters. Then to the actual racism, as it was called, seemed to be fairly low key. One young woman was annoyed that during a Zoom meeting somebody had made a joke about George Floyd, but I thought that students were renowned for saying outrageous and tasteless things and joking about stuff that their elders took seriously. It always used to be the case. Tacky jokes were just what students did. Is this really a case of racial prejudice, or is it just another young idiotic student trying to shock people? And the university didn't investigate particularly, possibly because they felt the same as I did. It's the sort of tacky thing that you expect students to say. I'd like to see a little more objective study of things relating to racism and anti-racism both. But my suspicion is that objective study and logic are the last things which those engaged in busily stoking up tension about these matters really wish to see.